And welcome to At Issue. Thank you for joining us. I'm H. Wayne Wilson, and this is going to be an intriguing conversation. I'm going to introduce three gentlemen, and I'm going to sit back and let them chat, I have a feeling, because we're going to be talking about the impact of money in politics, what happens with redistricting, and things of that nature. And to have that conversation is the political reporter for the Journal Star. That's Chris Kjærgaard. Chris, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Joining us once again, he comes down every so often from Chicago. We appreciate it. David Melton is here. He's the executive director of the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform. Thank you for coming down.
Thank you, H. My pleasure to be here.
And also Dale Reisinger is here. And it would be totally appropriate to have a former legislator on the program when we're going to discuss money in politics. So Dale, thank you for joining us. A senator from 2003 to 11.
Correct.
All righty. And with that, I'm going to start with David, but and this is a real vague question, but money in politics, is there a solution to this? We just, by the way, how much was spent on the governor's race in Illinois?
The governor's race, someplace in excess of $100 million. Exactly how much, we can tell you a little more in a few months, but roughly $100 to $110 million was spent on the governor's race. And as one political commentator said in one of our postmortems, it seemed like never was so much spent to say so little.
And television's probably to blame for part of that. We get the 30-second sound bites. And by the way, mentioning that you had a chance to participate in some of the debates, you noticed that regardless of what questions we asked the two gubernatorial candidates, they fell into their talking points.
They had talking points right away. They almost ignored the questions, and it's to the credit of the journalists that they continued to pursue the original question that was asked, but they were very on message, and you did not get much more, sadly, out of the debates than you were able to get from a 30-second television spot or repeating the same bromides over and over in campaign appearances.
So we might as well jump into solutions. I mean, is there hope?
There actually is hope, although the public actually believes, according to recent polls, 90% of them see money in politics and the corrupting effect it's having as a serious issue. But about the same 90% believe there's no solution, there's no way to get money out of politics. And to a certain extent, they're right. You can't get money out of politics. Campaigns are always going to cost money. That's a cost of democracy, basically. But there is a solution, which is what we need to be able to convince most people of, and they're not aware of it. There are solutions. So we're pursuing one that's called a small donor matching system, which is a way of trying to shift where the money to fund the campaigns comes from. Basically, it's our feeling that if you want politicians to be responsible and have their first duty to the general public, then the general public has to step up and essentially help them fund those campaigns, help them pay for that the same way we pay for legislators' salaries and other costs of democracy. And these systems have actually worked quite well in some places. The most well-known example is New York City system. They use this system for financing their mayoral and city council elections. They get a very high participation rate. And the way it works is essentially the candidates, once they raise a required number of small contributions to prove that they're a serious candidate, they can opt into the system. They can get public matching funds to match up to any donation up to $175 from each qualified voter, and up to an overall cap that's set by a commission in New York. It's the amount that the commission thinks is necessary to run a competitive campaign, which they set in consultation with candidates and others. And the system has worked very well. They have relatively high participation rates of 70 to 80% of the politicians. And it has a beneficial effect on the electoral system because, number one, it encourages politicians to, instead of spending their time in rooms making endless calls to potential donors, it encourages them to get out on the stump and talk to actual voters who can actually afford to make these relatively small contributions. So they can combine the politicking with the fundraising in a way that they now can't because they tend to focus on bigger donors. And it also increases the diversity of the candidate base and reduces the barrier to entry, so that if there's somebody who's actually interested in public policy but they don't have the connections to raise the money for a campaign, they still have a shot at being able to effectively run. And that increases the diversity. It tends to increase the participation rate by voters, both as donors and as campaign workers and so on across the city. And so it's a very interesting system, and we are trying to convince some some localities here in Illinois to consider it.
Was that part of the issue for you, Dale, when you ran for state senate in terms of raising funds so that you could actually be competitive?
Yeah, when I ran, I was a novice and had no idea how much money you needed to run. We ended up spending over $800,000 on my side of the race. My opponent spent about the same amount of money. At least I won. The political side of what David was talking about is this, though. As soon as you propose something, both parties, be it the Democrat Party or the Republican Party, are going to take a look at it and say, does this tip the scale one way or the other in our direction? If it tips it in our direction, we're all for it. If it tips it against us, we're all against it.
And that's a very good point, and that's why people who have proposed these things, I'd say two of the leading intellectuals who have written extensively about this are Larry Lessig at Harvard and Zephyr Teachout, who ran for the New York governorship, who's at Fordham, and they've both written a number of books on this. And they make the point. They make Lessig, particularly in his book Republic Lost, makes an extensive argument about why this is a bipartisan issue that should be as important to people, regardless of your political persuasion, to solve.
Mm-hmm. Right. And in this particular circumstance, one thing that I think you hinted at but didn't really get into, David, is you've also got the influence of leadership money in all these political races, and we see that in the top tier legislative contests every session. What interests and somewhat concerns me going forward with this into this new legislative session is, as Dale said, both parties tend to look at any new proposal and ask themselves, is this better for me or us? Is this better for the other guys? And will it tip the balance? We know going into this new legislative session, the incoming governor has already said he's got $20 million set aside in a campaign war chest with donations he and several others with money have made that they have announced they're going to use to help push their legislative agenda. Right. So you have a push toward more parity there between a new incoming Republican governor and his interests and the Democrats in House and Senate leadership.
But it's still a bad system in my view, whether you're looking at it from the Republican side or the Democratic side. In each case, somebody has to go to a kingmaker, whether it's the governor on the Republican side or the legislative leaders on the Democratic side, and those people control the flow of money that control whether you can raise enough money to run your campaign if you're in a competitive race. That's the way the system has evolved in Illinois.
We haven't talked that much about legislative districts and redistricting, but whenever I was a state senator, after I got elected, I was elected in a Republican district. It wasn't that our party drew the districts, but whenever the Democrats drew the districts, what they had left was Republican districts. I like to tell people I was the best senator they ever had, but the truth of the matter is, I was in a Republican district, and as long as I didn't do something really bad, I was going to get reelected. If you take a look at these last elections in the Senate, there was really only two races, Springfield, I think, and the Quad Cities. Republicans won one, the Democrats won one. But a ton of money was poured into those and they could, and if you take a look at other candidates who didn't have races, they were putting money into that race. For their candidate, for their party candidate.
Well, is that part of the problem that in the case of Illinois, Michael Madigan is not only the Speaker of the House, he heads the Democratic Party. And you watch the flyers. If you take a look at the flyers you get during a political campaign, at the bottom it says who financed it. And it's usually, and in fact almost exclusively, not the candidate's campaign. It's the Republican Party or the Democratic Party.
That's the way the system has evolved here in Illinois, that for legislative races, like I said, the legislative leaders tend to be the kingmakers and control the money. Now with the Republican governor who's rich, he can act in the same way.
And that leads to, well, if Mr. Madigan or Mr. Cullerton in the Senate helped me as a Democrat, how beholden am I to?
Well, and that question relates to whether or not you want a challenger in your next primary and the extent to which you can buck your party. As we've seen sometimes with, for example, downstate Democrats, it seems as though Speaker Madigan understands that sometimes they have to vote their district more than their party on some issues, and he's been able to make allowance for that. even more since he not only has a majority, but a supermajority, and the same for President Cullerton in the Senate.
And you know, every individual's different. Leaders can stand one or two renegades. They can't stand a lot. And in fact, in some ways, it's kind of nice for them to have one or two renegades, you know. Yeah.
Prove they aren't all powerful.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. It's money really plays a big role in all of this. And you know, I go back to my campaign and why I spent so much money. We had two media centers, Peoria and the Quad Cities. And the Quad Cities was just on the edge of mine. And we weren't going to go into the Quad Cities into the television station because most of that advertisement goes over into Iowa anyway, okay? But my opponent went into that. And when my opponent went into that, I had to go into that and counter it. And so you spend a ton of money and what is it worth? You know, it was questionable.
And that's true, I think, across politics and regardless of party. All politicians, I think, feel if my opponent's going to do something, I have to match it, and so you get into this kind of an arms race.
Sure.
Well, and I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead.
I was going to ask in terms of the pilot programs that you brought up before, because it seems to me if you have enough successes you can demonstrate in Illinois, you start to approach a critical mass where it becomes a wise idea.
Right.
How do you do that around the state and get enough buy-in around the state for that?
That's a very good question, and our group is working with a coalition of other reform groups trying to do that essentially. We are focused at the moment on trying to get a couple demonstration projects, pilot projects off the ground in Evanston and Oak Park, and there is a ballot question that's going to appear in the City of Chicago ballot at the end of February. The Common Cause has gotten on there. Advisory referendum about adopting such a system. But we're also working with the League of Women Voters and the Citizen Advocacy Center to try and identify other places outside Chicago area around the state where we could try and adopt these kinds of things, like a Peoria or a Rockford or a Champaign, and try and set up this kind of system basically to demonstrate that it can work.
Right, and certainly that's critical because particularly in downstate, you have the question of, okay, so this has been done in Chicago. What about downstate? How does it work here? There's always that parochial interest that needs to be demonstrated.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we recognize that, and we are all for demonstrating, you know, setting it up in other places to prove that this can work.
And there's always the fear of change.
There is always the fear of change.
We know what the problems are right now, but it's a system that we know. And if we change, then how's that going to affect them?
And that's the biggest problem with convincing existing incumbents to change the system is they feel, okay, I at least understand how the current system works. I don't know how this new system is going to work.
Right. The current system, unfortunately, requires a lot of citizen engagement if you really want to know what's going on. Illinois does, I would say, a very good job of requiring disclosure, particularly in the lead up to an election and for substantial campaign donations. But you have to be an engaged citizen to want to see that. And while it used to be that required going and looking at the State Board of Elections website and pouring your way through the D2s or the A1s that you have to file within just days of receiving a campaign contribution within 30 days of an election, it's gotten slightly easier now. I personally follow that on Twitter. The Chicago Tribune has an excellent Twitter account that tells you when someone has received a large donation of $1,000 or more. But again, I have to be an engaged news consumer to want to know, for lack of a better term, who's buying my candidate.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right that there is pretty good disclosure requirements here in Illinois. Well, there are pretty good disclosure requirements, but in order to get that information, that's the key to making it an effective vehicle for the public. We set up a database taking the information off the State Board of Elections database and trying to make it more user-friendly in terms of searches. We set up a database. We have a site called the Sunshine Database that does that. There's another organization called in Montana that runs this information, but there's usually a lag time in when they get the information posted. So there are places you can find it, and for federal elections you can find it through the Sunlight Foundation. But you do have to be engaged, and you have to go search it out. So yeah, that is a problem, and part of the problem is that because there are fewer political reporters these days that are spread more thinly, they don't have the time to dig as deeply into particular issues as they used to.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that in the Senate when I was in the Capitol. Reporters would come and they'd interview you and they'd get your comments and so forth, but they didn't have time to do really a background check on everything. So they were basically in their article quoting, what you had to say, and whether you were accurate or not, that's what was reported.
That's the problem. If it's just he said, she said, but you don't have any judging of the relative credibility of those statements, then the public just sees it as, well, it's just a political fight, one side versus the other.
Exactly.
And the consequences to these campaign donations last far beyond the election and who ends up winning a Tier 1 race or denying somebody a supermajority or anything else. A campaign donation for a 4-year Senate term from a large special interest may not come into play until there's, just to pick something at random, one of the electric companies looking for a change in the rates, their ability to do something with smart grid technology, something like that, where there's legislation being carried 3 years after a race.
Right, and with all due respect to the U.S. Supreme Court, I think they're a little either naive or disingenuous when they say the only thing that matters is a quid pro quo kind of arrangement. Most politicians are honest people. They're not willing to let their vote be bought. Right. But what the money does buy is access.
Yeah, I agree with that totally.
We've been talking about money and disclosure and things. I want to talk, and you broached this, Dale, the question of redistricting. And every time we see an effort to put redistricting on the ballot, a politician comes out and says, no, we got to knock that off the ballot. Is there any hope of redistricting getting back on the ballot?
Well, I think there's hope for it, and I think that's one of the things that we have to do. And I think because what it does, it really makes your politician then responsive to the voters. If you're in a district that's heavy Democrat or heavy Republican, and your only concern is that you're going to get another person of your party in the primary running against you, and even then, it's not a real problem unless the party supports that person. Then you're not as responsive to the voters as you would be otherwise. And after all, that's why we send people to Springfield, to be responsive to the people and what the people's needs are.
I would agree with that. I think Dale's right. And there was an effort to try and reform the redistricting process here in Illinois. That's continuing. I think that coalition that we're part of as well is looking at whether they should try it again in 2016 or 2018. But I think there will be another attempt made to amend the Illinois Constitution to reform and come up with a more rational redistricting and more effective redistricting process to take it out of the hands of politicians. You should have the voters deciding what their districts are, deciding who their politicians are, not the politicians deciding who their voters are.
Though there are times when even political redistricting does not have to be a deeply partisan and divisive process. I would point locally to Peoria County, which did actively involve Republican members of the county board, Democratic members of the county board, in a process that passed unanimously.
It does not have to be, and
right,
under the Illinois Constitution it's not supposed to be, but the problem is the drafters of the 1970 Constitution were not cynical enough about this.
Right.
That's the
and
rare
I honestly believe the farther away that the congressmen aren't as close to the people as your state senators are, and they're not as close to the people as your local government is. So the county representatives, even though they're partisan, they're more in tune to the people of the area. And whenever I say that, I'm going to get a lot of flack because we have our congressmen coming back every weekend and being involved, and they are involved. But still,
His district is so big.
the people themselves have a harder time staying connected to somebody who's out in Washington doing work or somebody in Springfield doing work versus somebody that's working locally.
And part of that is also the way these districts are drawn. This last time for the congressional districts was, I think I described it when I wrote about it in a column, as slightly less abominable than the prior 10 years. And the 17th district, which incorporates Peoria, is the prime example of that. The previous 17th ran all the way down
to Decatur,
to St. Louis, out to Decatur through an alleyway in Springfield. It was horrific. It is slightly more compact, but it still forms a sea that runs from Rockford through the Quad Cities into Peoria. It's very difficult for someone to be close to their member of Congress who does come back every weekend or almost every weekend, but has to cover 3 different media markets and 150 miles north-south and whatever east-west of territory.
Yeah, and it's not. I mean, there are lots of horror stories about redistricting in Illinois. Cindy Canary and Kent Redfield, who's a emeritus professor at U of I on politics, just wrote a paper, which I think has been published through the Paul Simon Institute or Southern Illinois University. And also the Change Coalition has published it, recounting the history of redistricting and some of the war stories from redistricting in Illinois.
And for the record, Cindy Canary used to be with
She used to
the Illinois
She used to
Campaign
have
for
my
Political
position
Reform.
before they downgraded to me.
We used to have a humorous conversation in the Senate with my colleagues that were from Chicago, who talked about how they campaigned handing out flyers at the train station, and you know, their district is very compact because they have all their people right there, versus me out walking door to door in all of those counties, and some of them are spread out, you know, farm areas. So
Hard to go door to door in Stark County.
it really is.
There's only 6,000 people in the county. But regarding money, how difficult was it? What kind of time did you have to spend raising funds to run a race as opposed to meeting people in Stark County?
Well, you know, it was interesting whenever, you know, I wasn't a young chicken when I ran, and people said, well, aren't you tired? Because I worked every day hard at it. And I said, well, I'll be tired after the election, not now. But, you know, the candidate has to get out and meet the people. So he's out there meeting the people, but at the same time, you know, somebody's driving you around. That's why you have a driver. Somebody's driving you around. You're on the phone talking to people, saying, hey, you know, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm for, you know, all those kind of things, and please support me.
So the Illinois campaign to have this public financing, however it works out, is a way to help alleviate that issue?
Yes, actually, that is part of the goal of a system. Is right now, particularly the higher up you go in terms of local to national offices, the bigger the problem becomes. So members of Congress now, there's some interesting stories in Larry Lessig's book about, and he lectures about this, about the amount of time that a new congressman is told during their orientation briefing to expect to spend between 40 and 60% of their time on the phone raising money. That's 40 to 60% of the time they should be spending on substantive policy issues.
So I suppose you could say that it's a good thing that someone like Bruce Rauner had all sorts of money. He could spend more time talking to people as opposed to raising funds.
From that respect, it is.
I don't know that that's good, but so real quickly, there are no easy solutions, but I want to quickly ask you in 15 seconds apiece the question of term limits. Dale.
Well, I think term limits are a good thing if they're far enough out. You don't, you know, we have tremendous staff in Springfield, and I'm sure they do in Congress and everywhere else, but we had tremendous staff, and if you make it short, if you made it the 8 years that Rauner said, I think the staff would be running things. So I think it needs to be at least 15 years.
I agree with the problem that Dale has pointed out. I feel like we already have term limits. They're called elections. And I think if we make that system work properly, the term limits questions become moot, and we don't need them.
And Chris.
I very much agree with that, and I'd also argue that institutional memory is a great thing. People point to someone like Mike Madigan and say that he has been there too long and controls too much. His counterpart is David Leach, the longest-serving Republican member of the House, who also has phenomenal institutional memory and is able to say, we tried this 20 years ago, here were the pitfalls.
Exactly.
I might suggest, as we close out this conversation, that maybe term limits on the general legislature is not a good idea, but maybe term limits for leadership in the legislature might be something to look at.
That might be something worth looking at.
And with that, I hate to cut you off.
No,
this has been a wonderful conversation, but we've run out of time. Chris Kiergaard of the Journal-Star and Dale Reisinger, Senator from 2003 to 2011. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And from Chicago, the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform. That's
ilcampaign.org.
David Melton, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
And we thank you for joining us on this conversation. We'll be back next week with another edition of At Issue.